Level podcast. Your Masonic podcast. Join the hosts Billy McIntyre and Sam Earl Sedgey as they delve into the world of Freemasonry.
From days long ago and unread Masonic manuscripts long forgotten, there comes a podcast. One that is willing to scour the archives and dig through the lies to bring you the truth you so long desire and to keep you on the level. Join Sir Knight, Templar, Sam, and Billy as they pull back the curtain on a conspiracy that may be one of the biggest Masonry has ever seen. One that could mean the difference between outright ignorance and the true light in Masonry. If it had not been for the strength of our forefathers from long in the past, our craft would have surely fallen into complete darkness and obscurity. But how did we get there? And how can we help but not let this happen again? Don't turn that dial. Stay tuned and find out. To the next exciting adventure of On the Level podcast.
Mate, that was pretty epic question for Brother Billy and totally unexpected. But that was what an opening. What a lot of truth.
They'll be thinking, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah, well, I know that it's been quite some time since our last episode, and that was a myth-busting episode on the conspiracies of Freemasonry. And me and Billy got really passionate about all of this, and you know, we're cursed to continue to look into things and ask more questions. And we were really trying to find answers and dig into this and find truth to a lot of things that are going on. And boy, have we found something. And I've written up an entire document, a 15-page document that goes through this factually, and will be an open minor. And we've come to, something that wasn't secret, was never secret, was always open, but the connections were never put together. And there's a lot of Freemasons and 99% of the public that cannot make the differentiation between us and others who may have cause of the conspiracy theories and the falsehoods, depending on the actions that they've done, whether it may be true or not. You can see where these paranoias and these accusations have come from. But boy, this is going to be a game-changing episode.
I think what Sam has stumbled upon here, and I say stumbled very lightly because Sam digs all the time for stuff like this and finds the most interesting stuff you've ever could imagine. But what Sam's come upon here, the more I dig into it, it seems like it ties all of the Masonic theories and that are bad and all the stuff that the Catholic Church and others think about the Masons that are unpleasant. It all ties them together. And I'm talking about not only the stuff from here in America, but across the seas and everywhere. If you've heard something rotten, it almost seems like it comes from this same source. And if you'll listen, I think you'll come to the same conclusion I have. But you be the judge of that.
Absolutely. And I'm going to go through a few things. I'm going to, ask my worshipful brother Billy of his opinion, and we'll go back and forth and discuss. And this episode is really probably the episode that is going to debunk everything and set the parameter, the introduction of, and explaining a lot of the issues and the misconception and the confusion that a lot of people have outside of Freemasonry mainly, and possibly some within. And it's because the dots have not been connected. And this is the truth that needs to be told. And it's all there already. There's nothing that's secret. This is nothing that's conspiratorial. This is all factual. You can all look this guys up. It's all done. It's all documented. But no one's been able to bring it together like we have today and put it, and for everyone to make sense of what's going on. So I'm gonna start off and gonna go through a few statements to you guys and to everyone around the world. And first of all, thank you for listening to us. Thank you for putting up with us, and we've got a lot more historical shows to come. This is going to be a historical episode on Freemasonry, and we're going to deep dive in a few things, and I'm going to get Worshipful Brothers Billy's opinions as well. So, do you have anything to say before we start, Billy?
No, I'm really looking forward to digging into this. There's a lot to do. I told Sam before we started, I don't know that we'll get all this done in one episode, but Sam's he's the optimist. He thinks we can get it done. We'll see.
We'll do as much as we can. And the document that I've created, the volume that I've created is just volume 1, and there are more volumes for me to write up as I get more time, and my schedule has been crazy. So I've been doing this, on top of everything else I've got to deal with, which in these past couple of months have been a lot. It's been a lot. But without going into that detail, let's get stuck in. Freemasonry did not begin as a political movement. It did not begin as a religious sect or a vehicle for social engineering. It began as a moral and fraternal society that took the working tools of the medieval stonemason and converted them into symbols of ethical self-improvement. The earliest speculative lodges of the late 17th and early 18th centuries gathered men of different Christian denominations under a simple theistic requirement: the belief in the supreme being, and a willingness to meet upon the common ground of moral duty. The formation of the Premier Grand Lodge of England in London, 24th of June 1717, gathered the scattered practice a central authority. Now, we've said this on the show many times, that the actual craft predates the unification, which is 24th of June 1717, which is what I call the unification of Freemasonry. It predates several centuries. We have diaries which go through the 3 degrees 50 years before the formation here, and then we have evidence of hundreds of years before in the medieval times. And we can go even more further. It gets harder, but as I've said before in this podcast, I believe that this is 3,026 years old. But from a factual historical evidence of what we do know, this goes to the medieval times, and there are now even more stronger connections of the Cistercian order and the Knights Templar from the Cistercian order, bringing this to, creating aspects of Freemasonry that was carried after the supposed disbandment of the Knights Templars. But we won't get into that in this episode, but we'll talk about this. So 1717, the United Grand Lodge of England basically gave that scattered practice a central authority. Within a few decades, the system had spread across the British Isles, the American colonies, and the continent. By the middle of the 18th century, Freemasonry had become one of the most widely distributed voluntary associations in the Western world. The 18th and 19th century saw the craft rise to remarkable prominence. Kings, statesmen, philosophers, soldiers, and men of letters entered its lodges. In Britain, the presence of royalty and the careful preservation of the theistic and apolitical principles gave the institution a character of respectability and moral seriousness. The union of the 2 English Grand Lodges in 1813 produced the United Grand Lodge of England, which thereafter stood as a principal standard of regularity for English-speaking world. Sister Grand Lodges in Scotland, Ireland, and the great American jurisdictions maintained the same essential landmarks. These are the essential landmarks of ancient and free and accepted Masonry. The belief in the great architect of the universe, which many of us call God. The open volume of the sacred law, which in traditional lodges have been the Holy Bible. Maintained the same essential, and also the exclusion of political and religious debate from lodge, and the restriction of membership to men. So this is very important. The whole tenets, the whole landmarks of Freemasonry, I'm going to say it one more time. The essential landmarks: belief in the grand architect of the universe. A lot of us say God, the open volume of the sacred law, the Bible, the Holy Bible, the exclusion of political and religious debates from lodge, and the restriction of membership to men. These principles were not local customs. They were treated as the ancient and inviolable foundations of the craft. Is there anything you want to add to that, Billy?
No, I think that's perfect. I think that's perfect. And I also think it connects up to some of the stuff that happens later on, including the Taxel hoax that comes up a little bit later, but I'm not going to bring that up now. We'll talk about that later.
Right, yeah. All right, so moving on. On the continent, a different development was already underway. French Freemasonry absorbed the rationalism of the Enlightenment, and after the Revolution, the political passions of the successive regimes. By the middle of the 19th century, the Grand Orient de France had become the dominant French obedience and recognized the center of republican and anti-clerical sentiment. The decisive break came in September 1877. The Grand Orient de France Covenant removed from its constitution the obligatory belief in God and the immortality of the soul, substituting the principles of the absolute liberty of conscience. The change was not a minor adjustment. It was the fundamental abandonment of the theistic landmark that regular Freemasonry regarded as essential. Recognition by the Grand Lodge of England, by the United Grand Lodge of England, and by the great majority of regular Grand Lodges was withdrawn. The schism was complete. So what happened? What does that mean? So the Grand Orient de France removed, it being the biggest French, the most dominant French obedience, basically, where most French Masons basically voted to remove the belief in God and the immortality of soul, these fundamental things that have basically carried Western civilization till that point, and civilization before that. And they substituted the principle of liberty of conscience. So God was removed, and the theistic was removed, and the atheistic was implemented. Now, people of belief of God was still, if you believed in the supreme architect of the universe, which some call God, you're fine. If you didn't believe in the supreme being, now you could join. The change, as I said, it wasn't a minor adjustment. Now, it does continue. So, here we go. What followed was not merely an internal Masonic quarrel. The Grand Orient, freed from the theistic restraint and already inclined toward political engagement, entered more deeply into the cultural wars of the French Third Republic. It became publicly associated with secular education, the restriction of religious congregations, and the eventual separation of church and state. We back this up. The affairs of the Ficcis, sorry if I'm not French, so if I butcher these words, my apologies, of 1904 to 1905 revealed a system of political intelligence work conducted through Masonic channels of the Grand Orient de France. Organized anti-Masonry, already active, found the French record a living, highly visible target. The Judeo-Masonic conspiracy theory drew substantial contemporary material from the same source. By the early 20th century, a durable public image of Freemasonry as a secular activist and anti-clerical force had been fixed in large parts of European and Latin American opinion. So let's just stop there 1 second. So in 1887, there was the schism of the constitutional requirements of regularity was removed, and the UK Grand Lodge of England and all of the lodges of the Anglosphere basically did not accept them to be irregular. What does that irregular? What does that mean? A member of the Grand Lodge of the Orient de France is not allowed to enter any of our lodges. Can't enter under the jurisdiction of the United Grand Lodge of England, American lodges, a lot of the grand jurisdictions that follow, or any jurisdiction that follows the Grand Lodge of United England, which is the bulk of Freemasonry. I can't go to a lodge of the Orient of France and vice versa. They're not recognized. They're irregular. We do recognize them as historically as what they were before and what happened, but they're no longer deemed as our brothers, and they are deemed as irregular. So let me just show you the impact of what happened with this. So very, very soon after that was done, okay, that happened in 1877. In 1878, literally in less than a year, the United Grand Lodge of England and the regular Grand Lodges refused recognition, and there was a formal separation. In 1881 to 1905, the Farrer laws, the Affaire des Fiches, the separation law, basically happened. Now, this was the peak of their political activities of the Grand Lodge of the Orient of France. But something even more important happened that I've got in my notes that I'm going to pull up. I believe it was let me just get the information real quick. And I believe it was Pope Leo VIII. So let me just get to Pope Leo VIII, because a few years later, after 1877, Pope Leo VIII basically introduced a very famous bull, and that bull was banning basically and condemning Freemasonry. But out of a consequence, now remember, France was a very, very stringent and very strong Catholic country, and had very strong roots to the papacy due to its history. The church and then and also the French crown and kind of like the French tradition has heavily been involved in Catholicism, and even today, Catholicism still plays a huge role in French culture. Sorry, you about to say something,
Sam?
Billy?
Can I? Have you got anything about the Taxel hoax?
Yeah, yes, I do. Yes, I do. But if you want,
because I was going to that because that happened right in here about the same time too. So I didn't know if you were going to put that in there or not. Because I've got that.
You want to talk about Taxel hoax, and I'll back you up, because Taxel hoax is really interesting.
Okay. Well, let me tell you what I've got on that, and then you can add to that if you're okay. So Perfect. The Taxel hoax, if I'm saying that right, in 1890, the hoax was expose by Leo Taxel was intended to mock not only Freemasonry but also the Catholic Church. The pose was opposite of it. Taxel, the author of the anti-papal tract, pretended to convert the Catholic in 1884, and he wrote several volumes in the service of the new faith. These included the adventures of one Dr. Batil, a surgeon living in the French merchant navy, who infiltrated the Freemasons and observed their evil rituals that occurred all over the world. Buddhists, Hindus, spiritualists were all alleged to join the Freemasons in conjuring against the Catholic Church, and Batil uncovers the secret inner orders of the Freemasons and takes the orders directly from demons. As Dr. Batil's tale unfolds, he introduced Dana Vaughn, a former high priestess, who converts the Catholic faith, and was in grave danger of assassination from the vengeful Freemasons. In 1897, Taxel called a press conference in which he promised to produce Vaughn. Instead, he declared the revolutions of the Freemasons were all invented. 9 years later, he told the American magazine that intentionally he assumed that all readers would recognize these tales were just amusement and pure and simple, and too outlandish to even be true. But when he realized the stories were believed by so many, Taxel decided there was lots of money to be made, so he went ahead and kept publishing the stories. And he continued after that to perpetuate the hoax. And that's what I have. I found that written in many places. So
Well,
That's not a
I'm
form.
glad you've done your research, my worshipful brother, because let me just back you up and let's go through this. So, we have 1877. Okay, the Grand Orient de France, 1880 decision. And its subsequent strong political engagement in the French Third Republic made Freemasonry a more visible and polarizing force. Critics portrayed it as an atheistic, anti-clerical, political machine rather than a traditional fraternal order, which the ancient and accepted free accepted Masons, which we are, part of the United Grand Lodge of England and all the jurisdictions under it, including the United States of America Freemasonry, and we still follow that. We still follow the belief in God. We still follow the sacred volume of law. So that happened. The Catholic Church's response, okay, literally roughly 3 years after that, Pope Leo VIII, encyclical Humanum Genus, 1884. So actually, it's 7 years afterwards of the Grand Orient de France, strongly condemned Freemasonry. This fueled organized anti-Masonry activities, leagues, newspapers, and congresses. Notably in 1985, International Anti-Masonic Congress in Trento. In France, publications committees proliferated in the... So as soon as this happened, and as soon as one of the jurisdictions but literally went AWOL, basically, and just went rogue, which is what that happened, basically. They just gave up on a lot of the ancient free tenets that had been practiced way before the formation of the United Grand Lodge of England. Some would say, like myself, at the time of the First Temple of King Solomon. Political and cultural conflicts in France. The Grand Lodge of the Orient of France, the Grand Orient de France, role in secular education, which I spoke about in 1905, and a broader European trend. Similar patterns appeared in Italy, Spain, Austria, Hungary, and elsewhere. And later-wise, nationalist and later authoritarian movements amplified hostility. The peak of the organized persecution came in the 20th century in Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1935, Fascist Italy, Franco-Spain, where a lot of Freemasons were rounded up and killed or put into imprisonment because of the conspiracies and not being able to distinguish between an irregular practice of Freemasonry, which was headed by the Grand Orient de France, and the rest of our regular Freemasons that had nothing to do with any of this, and still today have got nothing to do with it. Now, here's where we go to your thing: organized structures and tax seal phenomenon from the 1880s to 1890s. So literally 3 years after the Grand Orient de France was the tax seal phenomenon, and then it carried on for 17 years. The anti-Masonic committees and publication proliferated in France. Abbé Gabriel de Bessonnes founded the Comité Anti-Masonique de Paris in 1892. So in literally in less than 20 years, an anti-Masonic committee was basically created, literally, not a long time after 1877, and contributed to journals such as Le Franc, Marconier, de Masquet, and Le Crux. The Universal Anti-Masonic Union was established in Rome in 1893. So still under 20 years, another anti-Masonic body was developed because of this. Similar groups appeared in Belgium, Italy, Austria, and Hungary, and elsewhere. Most spectacular is what you're talking about. The most spectacular episode was the Leo tax seal hoax. Basically, tax seal, as you said, a former Freemason, an anti-clerical writer, feigned conversion to Catholicism and produced a stream of sensational books claiming Freemasonry was Luciferian, basically satanic organization, practicing black masses, sexual rites, and devil worship, often featuring the figure of Diana Vogan and the Palladism. These works were widely believed in the Catholic circus and amplified popular fear. Tax seal was a prominent figure at the First International Anti-Masonic Congress in Toronto in 1896. And on April 1897, he publicly confessed the entire affair was fabricated prank designed to mock both Freemasonry and Catholic credulity. The revelation caused temporary damage to more extreme Catholic and anti-Masonic claims, but underlined the hostility. So basically, this man created a massive. He was anti-Catholic. He hated Freemasons as well, and he basically just played and swindled everyone, and basically created a hoax that still proliferates today. The hoax of satanic organization practicing black mass sexual rights. We went through this myth busting episode previously. Devil worship. This was all a fallacy. This was a massive prank, basically, that went wild, and still today is proliferated.
Well, when he found out that people would go for the sensationalism, he just kept making it more outlandish. From what I read, because he found out that people, the more sensationalism he made it, the more people bought. So he just kept making it more outlandish as he went, because people kept buying more and more books.
Absolutely. So the fusion with anti-Semitism and political radicalization from the 1880s to 1890s onward, anti-Masonry increasingly merged with modern political anti-Semitism into Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. Jews and Freemasonry were portrayed as allied forces of liberalism, capitalism, republicanism, and internationalism undermining Christian nations. This symphonist gained traction during the Dreyfus affair in France and fed into nationalistic movements. So the problem was happening, and here's the whole schism. Here's the problem: the Grand Orient de France did turn into a political organization. It did want to reduce the clerical influence in France and in other jurisdictions around the world. It believed, as we just said, in the conscience of liberté. Now, we're not here to dispute whether they're right or they're wrong, but we're trying to explain the massive divergence of this irregular Freemasonry that's not recognized to our Freemasonry, which is from the United Grand Lodge of England, and these are completely two separate divergents. And then we've got nothing to do with the Grand Lodge de Orient de France, which has caused all of these political issues. Whether they created these conspiracies, and all these conspiracies are the root of this, a lot of this, the incitement, the intensity, the velocity just skyrocketed after 1887, because there was a political active movement to divorce marriage into civil marriage. That was another thing that the Orient de France, the Grand Orient de France, was trying to make government the main bearer of marriage, as opposed where marriage historically was a religious affair in Christian Europe, at least, or in Western civilization, was always became a religious affair. I mean, you've got to go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, where civil marriage was a concept, but that basically stopped being the case after the proliferation of Christianity, where it became a religious affair. And that's the reason where before you would go to get married, you go to church to get married, back in Christian Europe. And so they were pushing for more secular, and they pushed for more secular education. So they were very successful, because as France laws and traditions dramatically change, a lot of the continents started to change, and a lot of the continents' ways and thinking was adopted also in England, slowly, a lot slower, and also across the transatlantic, eventually in the Americas after the 50s and well into the 60s and 70s. So let's have a recap. In 1887, the Grand Orient de France secularization, basically, and the Third Republic politics heightens Catholic alarm. This causes a lot of the Catholic establishment, especially in the papacy and in France, to freak out, basically, because you now had an organization that was being open about their agenda and what they wanted to do politically, and they stopped the very core tenets of what I said in the beginning, that Freemasonry is the landmarks are the recognition of a supreme being, the volume of sacred law, and not discussing politics or religion at all. And those fundamental pillars were absolutely changed and reversed through the Grand Orient of France. So before I go on, I want to continue a few things. So as I said, in 1904, again, this is all within the 30-year timeline, the Lafargue begins publishing the Affaires des Fiches document. These reveal that the Grand Orient of the France had supplied the French War Ministry with political and religious files on army officers. The scandal intensifies accusations of Masonic political interference. So here we have actual documents that were leaked and revealed of the Grand Orient of France supplying information of all political and religious files on army officers. Now, why did they do that? Well, the problem back then is France was, even then, was a fairly, very religious society. England was a fairly, very religious Christian society, and even America. And if you've listened to all the episodes, I remember just in the 80s, England being still, and when I was growing up, fairly religious. Like Sunday was a day of observation. I mean, I used to think it sucked because every time I was a kid and I had a Sunday off, I was looking forward to cartoons. But because we only had a few channels in England, it was all church services, and everywhere was closed. There was nowhere opened after 5 p.m. Everything was closed, and that was a religious observance. And even when I was growing up in primary school, this basically what you call in England K-12, in America K-12, where it's like 5 to 12-year-old schools. We call them primary schools in England. I remember some of my first theatrical plays we did were based on the Bible. Joseph and the Technicolored, his Technicolored cloak or his blanket or whatever. These were very Christian plays that we were taught, and this was a primary school. This wasn't a Christian school; it was a primary school. Jesus and the manger. These are all things I was taught in a normal primary school that wasn't a religious Christian school. There weren't any prayers every single day, but when we did stuff like that, it was all our plays was something from the Bible. And all that kind. When we were told about Christmas, we were given the biblical references about through our teachers. Now that's no longer the case. I think standard primary schools don't talk about Joseph and his Technicolor, clothes and his cloak or whatever, and all that kind of cool stuff. They don't talk about Samson and his hair being cut off. These are all things I was taught in school, and as I said, I did not go to a religious school. So and I went to a very, very mixed primary school of 6 to 8-year-olds from all different backgrounds in London. There are more immigrants in my school than there were, naturalized English people, basically. And it was all cool. We all, it was fun. We had loads of people from the Middle East. We had people from Africa. We had people from Asia. We had a few English people. We had people from Poland, all sorts of places. But when we were taught Christian values and Christian traditions in school. That is no longer the case. And so we're talking about the 80s here. Now you morph back into the 1800s. Jesus, it was a far more Christian, stringent, more adhered to the sacred volume of sacred law. It was a different world. Divorces were nearly non-existent. And, the adherence to the Bible, whether it was a Protestant or Catholic, was extremely high. So you imagine in that time, Billy, you had an fraternal organization that declared, the conscience of liberty must come first. The liberty of the conscience is first. And then, we're a political now organization that's going to, talk about progressive secular values and take away the link between the church and the state, and start taking religious symbols away from them. That was back then. So you imagine.
Well, this had to shake a lot of people to the bone.
Exactly. But here's the thing: you think about a fraternal order of men who sit in all sorts of places, who already have been in all these places, a politician, statesman, all this kind of stuff that are equally as. For these guys to do this, the fraternal order there that have sat in all these places and have been able to infiltrate all these lodges and bring all this about, basically. You can see a kind of Adam Weishaupt Illuminati thing going on here. I'm not saying Adam Weishaupt and Illuminati infiltrated the Grand Orient de France, but people can make stuff up like that and say this is what happened. But the disconnect here is the rest of the Masonic world, even Germany, the majority of German lodges disavowed this. A lot of places in Europe disavowed this. England and the English-speaking countries, Americas, Canada, we all disavowed this Grand Orient de France because we could not believe they took the supreme architect of the universe out and the volume of the sacred law, because these men of history, great, good, and all from all walks of life, were all God-fearing men, and predominantly majority, in a 99% Christian men. And so for them it was an anathema. But, they made a vote and they went their ways, and respectfully they did their own thing. But the problem is all this blowback, the general public and even people today, celebrities today and organizations today, cannot differentiate between the two. They all are brushing us all under one broad stroke, and hence, we have been living under this burden as well, even though it's been completely falsely painted on ancient and free and accepted Masons.
It's always easy to believe the stuff that you don't understand, and especially when something is sensationalism and makes a good story. These were some outlandish stories that was told. And so when, you get something sensationalism as, worshiping demons and being able to conjure demons and stuff, boy, that makes for a good story. And so, when you can repeat a story like that, that's a heck of a story to be able to tell. So, of course, it's easy to tell that story. And what's a better way to make somebody hate somebody that you don't like to begin with? And I'm going back to the ancient Catholic Church. I'm not picking on the Catholic Church now. I'm talking about back when they, disavowed the Masons. What better way to get them to hate them than to get a highly religious group, like the Americas and England and them, to say, hey, these people are they have priestess and they have high priests, and they're conjuring demons and they're worshiping, and that's pretty bold stuff.
Absolutely.
Of course they would hate them.
Absolutely. And no matter what you think, look, France was the first place in modern European Western civilization times to enact civil marriage as opposed of a marriage through the traditional religious means. Now, not saying this is right or wrong, but a lot of that was pushed by the Grand Orient de France. And this law of separation of church and state, a lot of it which came to a head in 1905, again, very close to 1877, it's less than 30 years, widely attributed by critics to Masonic influence, and further fuels Catholic and conservative hostility. So hostility grew obnoxiously, and it continued. Post-World War I period sees a renewed conspiracy theories like linking Freemasonry to the war's outcome, the Russian Revolution, the League of Nations, and social upheavals. Journals such as the Revue Internationale des Sociétés Secrètes and movements like Action Française sustain and update this discourse. Now, there is an issue because the motto of the Grand Orient de France is liberté, solidarité, and fraternity. Basically, liberty, equality, and fraternity, which is the same motto that a lot of the French politicians in France promotes. Liberté, equality, and fraternity. And that's how prolific in politics they became. They became a powerhouse. When you have an organization of men who now focus has turned from, self-improvement. What is our ancient and free sacred Mason? What is our traditional ways of what we do stuff? It's about our own self-improvement. It's about becoming a better version of yourself. It's about understanding more about the grand architect of the universe. It's about brotherhood. It's about community. It's about faith, hope, and charity. It's about what can you do as a human being to better the people around you, the society around you, through active work, but not crossing some sacred tenets, not getting political, not talking about religion, having tolerance and just focusing on the good work as opposed on, getting all politically active and trying to do something for an ideology. There was no ideology. It was, how do I become a better man? How do I become more tolerant and understanding and think before I act? How do I become from a rough stone to a more polished and more equal and beautiful stone, if I could use that as an analogy.
Right.
So that's what the ancient free and accepted Masons, which me and Billy are, and the tenets of the United Grand Lodge of England and all those under the umbrella of that, which is basically, the jurisdictions of the United States of America, Canada, and most of the Western free world. But all of this that we've just explained basically created an entire picture, and people were not able to distinguish between the two. And there's a reason for that. We are a very humble organization that is sometimes very insular. We just focus on our stuff, and we don't go and attack back. We don't go and try and debate anything. We keep our heads down and we just focus on the good work. And we've never really been good at PR. In fact, we probably sucked. We're probably the worst PR guys in the world. But that's more to do with our humility. That's more to do with the temperance and the rituals that we do, and it's not the tenets of Freemasonry is not about taking the credit. It's not about the titles.
Right.
It's about it's about the man you become.
Right. That's what I was going to say. It's because it's everything we learn in Freemasonry is not how to make ourselves look like a better person. It's to make ourselves become a better person. So everything we're taught is not how to show up better. It's to just become a better person. So we're not even looking to show up at all. And that's kind of our downfall when it comes to the general public and their perception of us, I would guess. Would be the best way to put that.
And to back this up, like Pope Leo VIII's encyclical Humanium Genus, 20th of April 1884, which is literally 7 years after what, the divergence, the schism, I call it, due to the Grand Orient of the France, was highly influential and more detailed than many earlier documents. It strongly condemned Freemasonry for naturalism, religious indifferentism, and it perceived the role of undermining Christian society. It is often best known for the papal texts on the subject, especially in the contents of the late 19th century rise in organized anti-Masonry, but of the continuation and intensification of a policy that had already existed. But this is basically basically the most detailed anti-Masonic kind of like bull on steroids compared to two before that. There were two before. One was Clement in 1738, basically that prevented Catholics from joining Masonic lodges on the penalty of automatic excommunication, and this was then there was Benedict. But there wasn't a massive detailed attack. The whole thing that happened in France was such a kind of like a massive shock, mental shock that reverberated not only around Europe but in the Catholic world, that it just turned the tables on a lot of Freemasons. And the problem is the lack of distinguishing the Grand Orient de France, that was just the Grand Orient de France and other Orients under its jurisdictions, between the vast majority of Freemasonry that just basically rejected what they did. And this is the problem. And so we go through that, and I'm just going to go back to where I basically left off on and go through our discussion that we're having. and explain why we're discussing this and what we've had to go through and what we Masons had to go through for all this. So, for example, just an understanding, right, about how notable Freemasonry was. The social composition of early speculative Freemasonry is broad but weighted towards the professional mercantile classes and the lower gentry, and increasing aristocracy and even royalty. This breadth of membership was itself a novelty. In an age of rigid social hierarchy, the lodge offered a rare space in which men from different ranks could meet as brothers under a shared moral vocabulary. The presence of high-ranking initiates further accelerated the boom. Frederick, Prince of Wales, was made a Mason in 1737. Later in the century, George, Prince of Wales, afterwards George IV, and his brothers, the Dukes of York, Clarence, Kent, Cumberland, and Sussex, all entered the craft. The Duke of Sussex, who will eventually become the first Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England after the Union in 1813. Royal patronage conferred upon Freemasonry as public legitimacy that few voluntary associations of the period could match. On the continent, the boom was equally striking. Lodges appeared in France, Netherlands, the German states, Scandinavia. Within a generation of 1717, Voltaire, famous Freemason, was initiated in the Lodge of the Nine Sisters in Paris in 1778. What did he say about what happened? Only months before his death, the same lodge later received Benjamin Franklin, who served as worshipful master while he was the American minister to France. Mozart was made a Mason in Vienna in 1784 and composed several works for Masonic occasions, most notably the Masonic funeral music and the opera The Magic Flute, whose symbolism is steeped in the language of the craft. Goethe was initiated at Weimar in 1780. In Prussia, Frederick the Great had already become a Freemason in 1738 while still Crown Prince, and under his reign, Prussian Freemasonry enjoyed a degree of official tolerance. In the American colonies, the growth of the craft paralleled the political maturation of the society that would become the United States. Jonathan Beechler, governor of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, was one of the earliest colonial Freemasons of high rank. Benjamin Franklin printed the first Masonic book in America and served as Grand Master of Pennsylvania. George Washington was initiated in Fredericksburg Lodge in 1752 and remained a member of the craft for the rest of his life. He sat for the famous portrait in the full Masonic regalia and laid the cornerstone of the United States Capitol in 1793 wearing his Masonic apron. At least 9 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence are documented Freemasons, among them Franklin, John Hancock, and William Ellery. A significant portion of generals of the Continental Army, including Marquis de Lafayette, himself a Mason, belonged to the fraternity. The presence of so many leading figures of American founding generation inside the lodge rooms of the 1770s and 1780s gave Freemasonry an association with a cause of ordered liberty that has never entirely lost the English-speaking world. The 18th century boom was not without internal tension. In England, the rivalry between the Premier Grand Lodge, often called the Moderns, and the rival lodge of the Ancients, formed in 1751, produced parallel systems of recognition and public controversy. The Ancients accused the Moderns of having departed from the order's ritual forms. The Moderns regarded the Ancients as irregular. This dispute was finally held by a union of 1813, which created the Grand Lodge of England under the Grand Mastership of the Duke of Sussex. Articles of the Union reaffirmed the essential landmarks that both sides in practice continued to observe in the belief of the Grand Architect of the Universe, the presence of the volume of the sacred law, and the exclusion of political and religious debate from Lodge. From 1813 onward, the United Grand Lodge of England stood as the principal reference point for regularity throughout the English-speaking world and beyond. The same landmarks were maintained by the Grand Lodge of Scotland, the Grand Lodge of Ireland, both of which had developed their own independent parallel systems. American Grand Lodges, although organizationally sovereign, adopted the same theistic and apolitical requirements. That means no politics. By the middle of the 19th century, a recognizable regular system existed across the British Empire and United States, bound together by mutual recognition and by a shared insistence upon the ancient landmarks. Members continued to grow. In England alone, the number of lodges under the Grand Lodge of England expanded steadily through the Victorian era. Freemasonry became a familiar feature of civic life in provincial towns and colonial outposts alike. Mayors, magistrates, military officers, clergymen of the established church, leading professional men were routinely found among its members. Again, there's a list of notable Freemasons. The Duke of Wellington, Sir Walter Scott, Robert Burns, along with a succession of Lord Chancellors, Admirals, colonial governors. In the United States, the role of distinguished brethren continued after the founding generation with figures such as Chief Justice John Marshall, Senator Henry Clay, and numerous state governors and congressmen. The common thread among these men was not a shared political program. They belonged to opposing parties, and they held differing views on almost every public question, but shared a willingness to meet upon the level, under the obligation of a theistic and moral fraternity that deliberately excluded politics from its proceedings. So all these men, all these great men who disagreed with each other, were of different Christian denominations, different political beliefs, different political parties. They all came together on the tenets. What Freemasonry brought was good men together to understand their differences, to find out that they're actually equals and they're actually going for the same thing, but to take the politics out and take the religion out, they were able to do more good. So the problem was the great boom of the 18th century and nearly 9th centuries therefore produced an institution that was simultaneously widespread, socially elevated, and constitutionally restrained. So it was restrained. There was no political shenanigans. There was no conspiracy theories. There was no evil kind of global, UN, world government thing. It was men just being able to meet for the first time and say, oh, I've never met my brother before, and but he's been a Mason for 20 years, and we've shared the same experience. We're able to share and give each other the time of day. And even though you may be a Catholic, or I may be a Protestant, or you may be this denomination, I may be that denomination, we can sit down and have a meal and learn from each other and bond and be able to move away from our natural instincts or possible biases that were built through cultural differences, through historical differences. This was uniting the good men of the West. However, let me continue. Its most distinguished members did not enter the lodge in order to advance a party or to undermine a church. They entered it into order to participate in a system of moral symbolism and mutual support that required a belief in a supreme being and forbade the introduction of controversies and that divided them from outside the lodge door. The combination of breadth and restraint is an essential character of regular Freemasonry as it stood on the eve of the events of 1877. It was against.
Could I add something,
Yeah, go
Sam?
on. Yes.
Oh,
Karen.
sorry.
Yes, please go on.
I just want to say something here for non-Masons that happen to be listening, because I know we have some that do listen, and I know this should be pretty common knowledge from other stuff we had, but in case this is the first time you're listening to one of our podcasts, the reason Masons don't talk about politics and religion, and it's not because you have to believe in a supreme being, which most of us is God, is because if you can't have a belief in a supreme being, then you can't give an oath that would be worth anything. So it's not that we don't believe in a God, but we found that if you take politics and religion itself out of meetings and out of gatherings, that's the two most things that most people argue about. So if you take those out of meetings, most of the arguments are already gone. So then you can get down to business of helping the community and helping others. That's what you're there for, and make yourself a better man. And that's what Mason's all about. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, Sam. I just wanted people to realize that we're not taking God away from anything, and that's what the Catholic Church believes a lot, very often. That's not it at all. We're just trying to keep arguments away from Masonry.
Well, I'm sympathetic to everything you've just said. I'm also sympathetic to. I'm not a Catholic, by the way. I'm a Christian, but I'm also sympathetic to the Catholic Church. I mean, from the Catholic Church's position, you see suddenly a branch of Freemasonry has basically, has just said, no, we don't believe in the supreme, especially in 1877, and submit to all this. Obviously, there's a massive panic and paranoia.
Sure.
Also, the detractors of Freemasonry within the Catholic Church who were not trying to be tolerant, and people outside, there you go, I told you so. I told you this was all a ruse. Look at them. And so it just increases that. And so it was against this background of the established regular practice that we still practice today as ancient and free accepted Masons. This regular practice of theistic, that means belief in the supreme being, apolitical, that means no politics, we're apolitical, no politics, and internationally recognized that the constitutional decision of the Grand Orient de France must be measured against. The Grand Orient de France did not invent a new form of Freemasonry in isolation. It departed from a form that had already been defined, practiced, and adorned by some of the most notable figures of the age for more than a century and a half. The landmarks that those men had accepted as the condition of the membership were the same landmarks that the Grand Orient chose to set aside. The contrast is starting to point of everything that follows. They rejected those tenets of George Washington, of Benjamin Franklin, of the kings of England, of men of all stature, of all ranks, basically, and they went off and they did their own thing. The problem was the world was not able, the public was not able to define the differences of what happened. And in fact, many of you listening here probably don't even know what a regular or irregular Freemason. No one that I've listened to on the popular podcasts that have defamed and basically give us falsehoods about the Freemasonry which we practice, ancient and free accepted Masonry, have even spoke about regular or irregular Freemasonry, although it's been explained for centuries. If you just look it up, it's all been there. None of this has been explained, that how we did not recognize this. We did not recognize their departure from what we call the landmarks, the tenets of Freemasonry that have been so important to Freemasons. To join a lodge in Illinois or in England and other jurisdictions, you must have a belief in the supreme being. That is no longer the case. So all this paranoia, all these conspiracy theories, they have some validation, not necessarily that they're true, but the validation is they come from a departed form of Freemasonry that's got nothing to do with us. And to have that burden on men who believe in the sacred volume of the sacred law, to have a belief in the supreme being, is kind of depressing. It's kind of upsetting, And as I said in the
it is,
and as I said in the shows before, it stopped me from joining. And when I was in my 20s, out of fear of all the malarkey and rubbish that I was fed, that was widespread, even in the 1990s. This was widespread. Just complete hocus pocus, all this rubbish about Satanism and rituals that don't even exist, sex rituals. There's none of that. Trust me, I would be out the door if that was all true within a jiffy, and most of us would be out the door in a jiffy. I'm not just I'm not just a Master Mason. I'm also a Knights Templar. I'm also a part of many of the Masonic organizations. I've seen none of that. And, look, I'll put my hand up. There are sometimes that some places, because of our structure, which I explained, is very decentralized, there might be a couple of bad apples that may give us a bad name, but that's not our focus. There's a lot of trust in Freemasonry. There's a lot of trust that, been given that, the decentralization, it gives lodges a lot of, oversight and look. but it's all based on our bylaws and our codifications. And so we want to spend the show and explain the differences and where this conspiracy has come from, and the schisms, the constitutional breach, and the transformation. Now, on the good news in France, because we have talked a lot about the Grand Lodge, Grand Orient de France, is in the early 1900s, in 1913, the Grand Lodge Nationale Française, GLNF, was formed in 1913, precisely in order to restore regular relations with the United Grand Lodge of England. It required the belief in the Grand Architect of the universe. It retained the volume of the sacred law and prohibited political discussion in the lodge. The GLNF was recognized by the UKGL and remains a principal regular Grand Lodge in France. Later, bodies continued the pattern of fragmentation. French Freemasonry after 1870 therefore became a landscape of multiple obediences, some following a adogmatic and politically open model of the Grand Orient de France, others seeking to recover or preserve the theistic and apolitical standards of regularity. So, what is the other issue? Back then in 1877, just to remind you, why is this a big deal? Why are we bringing this? There was the British Empire, and then there was the French Empire. Arguably the two most dominant powers. And with the French Empire being across the world, it was very influential politically, culturally, militarily, and obviously the collapse happened in World War II and beyond, and even what some would say it was the end of the French Empire after World War I. But don't forget, it wasn't just France. There was the French Empire and everything that came with that, which was a substantial military, cultural, and influential might around the entire world. In fact, it was because of the French government that the British got into World War I, which inevitably became the First World War, and millions upon millions of good men died, and also civilians. Now, here's the dangers that happened. The dangers of that transition were already visible to regular Freemasons of the period. Regular constitutions forbidden the discussion of politics and religion inside a lodge for that precise reason. Once the lodge, guys and girls, becomes an arena for partisan programs, it ceases to be a lodge in the original sense. It becomes a political club that happens to use Masonic forms. Social engineering, deliberate use of organizational power to reshape public institutions, education, and relation between the church and the state, flows naturally from politicization. The Grand Orient's subsequent engagement with secularizing legislation of the Third Republic and its roles in the affairs des fiches demonstrate the practical consequences. The craft was no longer a system of moral self-improvement under the eye of the Grand Architect. It became an instrument in the cultural wars of the French Republic. This was a vast departure from the traditions of ancient, free and accepted Masonry as practiced under the United Grand Lodge of England and its sister jurisdictions. Regular Freemasonry had never claimed the right to redesign religious or political order of society. Its landmarks existed precisely to prevent such a claim. The candidate was required to believe, and still does, believe in a supreme being, not to promote a particular theology. He was required to leave politics at the door, not to advance party. The obligations bound to him to a moral conduct, fidelity to his brethren, and secrecy concerning the modes of recognition, not to the reconstruction of the state. So when the Grand Orient of de France, which was established in France. What was France? It was the French Empire, the second biggest empire known to man at that time, with immense power, immense influence, abandoned the theistic landmark and embraced political activism. It did not merely modify the craft, it transformed it into something else. The name, the symbols, and the ritual forms remained. The sacred foundation of the constitutional restraints did not. So, my point is, when you morph the institution, therefore, no matter the degree of whatever it is, regular and ancient and free accepted masonry, basically our version, continue to meet under the volume of sacred law, to require the belief of the grand architect, which we call God, I call God, and to prohibit political discussion. And so that's basically the gist of everything, to be honest. And I've got more notes, and then I know this is going to be our first episode, Billy, but I really wanted to see if I can make people understand that the separation and how we have failed until hopefully today. And this will be the start of many to research and look into exactly what we said. And just all the facts are there. Everything I've said is factual. There's no conspiracy here. We're not saying what happened was right or wrong. We're not saying the Grand Orient, the France, there are a lot of people who believe that what they did, if you look at it from a political angle, from whatever political spectrum from, some people on this political spectrum will be like, you know what, I actually agree with what they've done. I think they've done a bloody good job. I'm glad they did that. That's not what we're here to say. What we're here to say is the blowback, the consequences of that, the conspiracy theories, the stuff that you see on the internet through these internet shows that have, massive reach. It hasn't stemmed from the traditional tenets of Freemasonry that are prolific still today. They stem from a part of Freemasonry that was in a particular demographic, a different and geographic in France, which just so happened to have a massive empire as well, and then proliferate a different version, a version that was not Masonic and diverged from Masonry, and turned it into a political organization, proliferating what they call liberty, equality, and fraternity, and a political and organizing that across the empire and through other jurisdictions that the ancient and free accepted Masons like us stopped recognizing. And that,
if you go back to our last Mythbusters that we talked about, it's been 2 or 3 shows ago, maybe even more than that. You'll see that whole interview we did, and I'm not going to recap it now because you could just go back and look if you'd like, but you'll see that all the things we talked about is basically this. I mean, again, it doesn't have anything to do with the stuff that we call regular Freemasonry. It's the irregular that we just covered.
Absolutely, and well said. And so it's been a privilege and joy to show the distinction. Hopefully we've been able to settle the confusion and the misrepresentation. And as long as, for me, we can actually attribute where all of these wild conspiracies have come from, where all these kind of myths and legend have come from, the political conspiracy theories to the insane kind of ritual fantasies that have been made up. It's really come from that particular time, and that schism really exploded and created the imagination of the dangers of Freemasonry. It may have even predicted some of the things that the Grand Orient de France have done and did in the past. But it's very important for listeners around the world to distinguish something that's irregular, that we don't recognize. It's got nothing to do with, as I said, the United Grand Lodge of England and the sister jurisdictions around the world. And it's very important to finally come out and say, hey, that's that lot. And if you're going to mention that stuff, please attribute it to that and not to Freemasons around the world who not only reject that, but do not practice those things and are far removed from our ancient landmarks that I think we've articulated very well. And that's got me excited for us to go back in history and talk about these great men. George Washington, who gave up the presidency, who did not want to be a king, the great transformations of the likes of the Duke of Wellington, and how he transformed and saved Europe from Napoleon's grasp in the Battle of Waterloo. And there's so many other great and good Freemasons, and the focus on the self-improvement, this ancient tradition that's been handed through the generations and through the centuries. And hopefully a lot of Masons who weren't aware of this now know about it. And I challenge everyone to go and just research the Grand Orient of France, 1877, the things that happened beyond there, and the escalation of that. And
I think there's still a little bit more left on this. If we really wanted to, if this does well, I think we could continue this on to where the Anti-Masonic Party of America, I really think it all connects to this.
Well, not that. And more importantly, how the fascists and even the communists picked up on this and used this as a tool, and especially in Nazi Germany, where a lot of what the tragedy was, the Prussians back then, the Germans, for a good half a century refused. They rejected, like England, they rejected the version of the Grand Orient of France. But because Freemasonry was in the entirety of Freemasonry was maligned with all of this, the Nazis couldn't see, or maybe they did, or maybe they didn't care. But it was a great excuse to blame the Freemasons, who were ancient Freemasons, and they killed over 200,000 of our brothers, who had nothing to do. Had nothing to do with this. And my contention would be, if there is a strong argument that if 1877 didn't happen and that thing did not take place, there may have not been that backlash through authoritarian states, whether fascist or communistic or whatever, that basically either banned Freemasonry or killed a lot of our brethren. So there was a lot of blowback. A lot of innocent men, unfortunately, gave up their lives of being Freemasons, and somehow, that was so bad in Nazi Germany that even today, Masons in Europe and America wear a particular pin to remember those who were killed for just being a regular Freemason, and there's been a great mix-up between these irregular bodies that call themselves Freemasons but have departed drastically from our ancient landmarks and our tenets.
Sure.
And so then we have all these people come on who have got, whether they want clicks or have a massive audience, and then they bring a version of Freemasonry that is not applicable to us. And us, I mean American Freemasonry, British Freemasonry, Scandinavian Freemasonry, Australian Freemasonry. Majority of Freemasonry is recognized by the United Grand Lodge of England. We've got nothing to do with any of that, but we take that burden and we're soiled with it. And so I'm hoping this will teach and educate those who are listening in, who have larger voices in the public scene, who do tune into us and listen and learn from us. And I have seen subtle changes in the past couple of weeks, which have been great, but also educate them and challenge them to check everything we've said, look into everything that we've said, and please look at the history. It's all out there. This is not a conspiracy. I'm not revealing anything that is not already out there. We just happen to be blessed by God to connect the dots and say, this is what, and this happens. People discover things and bring it to the fore, and then people learn new things, whether it's a new discovery, whether it's a scientific discovery, whether it's a historical discovery. It just happens to be me and Billy have connected these dots and were the first to explain it to the masses and to everyone else. And although people might be justified, there might be cohorts of people that were not happy that this irregular part, which had nothing to do with us, did modernize the marriage to become a civil marriage and take it from, did push for the separation of the state and church. There might be a justified emotional anger towards that. But that was never the acts of ancient and free accepted Masons. That was the acts of a body that removed themselves away from our tenets and created something that diverged immensely from us and became a political activist body that still operates to a great extent today. And so we need to have a distinction. What I'm saying is we need to have a distinction between the two and realize, that practice is not accepted. We don't go to those. We're not allowed there. They're not allowed in our lodges. We don't recognize them. And that's the most important thing is, I'm here to clean the record on behalf of millions of our brothers and millions upon tens of millions of our brothers, if not hundreds of millions who are in that celestial lodge, basically, who have borne a burden. And there were little telltales of post World War II, the Freemasonry in terms of the Western Anglosphere of Freemasonry and those who are regular Freemasons of ancient Freemasons. Basically, we kind of closed our doors. We kind of hunkered down because the propaganda, the abuse, the misinformation just went wild, and so we just kept going, not underground, but we just kept our heads down and we didn't interact as much like we did before. I just went through a lot of it, like how we used to parade a lot before, and how we used to be everywhere, and how we used to be extremely acceptable. But a lot of
Masonry almost closed its doors during, most of the Grand Lodge went dark, for a while in America. And I still think, like I said, we can cover a lot of this stuff and it's all connected to this, in my opinion. And, it was reformed then again later on and during the 1900s there, after the anti-Masonic party kind of dissolved. And we can get into that. And if this goes well, I'm going to push Sam to do a part 2 to this because I really think there's a lot left here on the table. But that'll come later because there's so many things we want to cover. With history and our forefathers that were so and on both sides of the creek or the pond or whatever you want to call it. I don't think it's a creek. I think it's more of a big pond. But I think Sam can talk more on that. He's really our he's more of our historical guy. I'm just a color guy. Once in a while, that chimes in with something that may not even make sense, but I like to put it in there anyway. So here we are.
But no, you know what? I think this is a start, an opening to what we'll call the Further Light episodes, in distinguishing and setting the record straight. And we're not disparaging either or, but we're just saying where these things came from. And for people to be a bit more mindful before they point fingers, before they create hysteria, before they say things that, I'm going to, be honest. I remember in USA Peoria, I was going to a lodge one day and there was some person put some packet on my windshield outside of a lodge. And I opened it, and there's all this hysterical nonsense about how Freemasonry is satanic and all that kind of stuff. And I read it, and it was a bunch of nonsense because, fortunately, I'm a historian and I've done my research, and I know that's not true because I'm in it. But the problem is that all of this has riled people to do these really aggressive things that people shouldn't be doing. That there is a cult out there that not only fears us but detests us and thinks that we're some sort of bunch of monsters that do some weird stuff that is far from the truth. And it's I'm just standing for the brotherhood. And we've been, the Knights Templars were persecuted. The tragic tale that we've kind of covered a little bit that we've got to go through, an absolute tragic tale of God-fearing Christian men that were persecuted. It's such a tragic, and we've kind of had followed this curse of prayer persecution. And what's really funny though, from a religious context, from a spiritual context, persecution has been part of, those who keep their heads down, try and do the good work, and try and just self-improve and be better people. There's always been that antagonism that just keeps, trying to knock people down. And all I'm saying is, before you say a word that is ignorant, and say that, oh, it's satanic, it's demonic, do your research. Talk to people with actual knowledge. Try and ascertain the correct informations before you go down that rabbit hole that leads nowhere and puts fear and misinformation into young minds and good people. And just reach out and knock on the door, and hopefully you'll find someone like me that can basically articulate. And the other problem is that because of our order and our membership, a lot has been forgotten. And so a lot of Master Masons, this might be, and we're talking about a lot of Master Masons, may not even know what we've just said, and this might be news to them, and they may have learned something new, which is fantastic. And we're very glad and privileged to, teach and educate. And I'm always learning. I've got fantastic teachers that teach me, and sometimes it takes a bit of investigation and someone who's heavily into history to put the pieces together, and it's been a privilege to do it, and there'll be more on it. What are your thoughts, Billy?
And if you know someone that could benefit from hearing some of these things, that maybe you could maybe convince them that maybe they were mistaken about some of the things they do believe, share this podcast with them. Maybe that will open their eyes. And I don't want to pick on the Catholic Church or any other church, because it's more than just the Catholics that believe these things that are not true about the Masons. But it wasn't just it was the Pope Leo that did put this decree out about the Masons. But, every Pope since then could have rescinded that, but none of them have. And I know it's come before them many times to take that decree away from the Masons, but none of them have ever done that. So it's not just
you also got to put in there. I mean, no matter how egregious one may think it is, you also got to put your feet in their shoes. I mean, you got to put in a timeline. I mean, imagine you were the Pope in 1887 in that period, and the world back then was completely different compared to the world today. It's nowhere near. I mean, the way we dress, the way everyone dresses, as I said, the single parent households, families, everything, traditional family, now nuclear family. There was, nuclear family wasn't even a concept back then. It was a completely divorced world. I mean, the invention of cars was, all these kind of things were just on the precipice, or if not in mass, not in the hands of the mass people. Ford didn't build mass-produced cars yet for everyone to have access to automobiles and vehicles. I mean, you're in the age of horse and car, and where religion was still, for the 90%, let's say 5 or 8% of Europe, was an integral part of their daily lives. And so to then have a fraternal organization to come out and do that, and the reaction that has, and then not only come out, but politically become active to influence and secularize, right or wrong. Right or wrong, we're not here to debate what we know, if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but to intentionally secularize and take the power away from the clergy and be anti-clerical for whatever reasons, whatever enlightenment or whatever you want to call it, basically, that created the chaos, that created the division, that created everything we're talking about, that pushed the Pope Leo VIII's hand to put the most egregious and detailed listing of why Freemasonry is horrible. What then happened, what you taught, the Talix came out with the satanic stuff and parading the fiasco and all that, and creating a whole myth and legend about no Freemasonry and that kind. And then saying, oh, by the way, this was a prank. I got you guys and made the anti-Masonic people look stupid. But at the same time, those conspiracies and those things still continued. He was just trying to run amok of the extreme conservatives. He was anti all of that, and he was anti all the clerics, but he just wanted to make fun of them and say, ha ha ha, look at these idiots, I made it all up. But the problem is that how many places around the world without the internet, without the ability to pick up a mobile phone that did not exist, how many people did it reach? And before the truth reached to people, how many people already made up their minds? How many people have already, I don't care what he's saying. Maybe he's lying. Maybe he was bought. That's the problem. It's the whole world was different. So my point being is, for every kind of action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And for every kind of massive, divergence, you are going to have chaos. You are going to have divergence. You are going to have ruin. You are going to have all of this nonsense happen. And so I'm not trying to defend the Pope. I'm not a Catholic here. I'm not defending Catholicism at all.
Right.
But I think sometimes we've got to understand that the biggest, for my understanding of all this research, is just the lack of understanding, the misinformation, the lack of clarity that's then built up as, it's like, the best way I can explain it is when your neighbor, when you're living in the village, and then suddenly 10 people turn up, and these 10 people or 10 families cannot speak the language whatsoever. And then for the next 5 years, they don't make any effort to speak the language. And suddenly you've got families who you can't communicate to, there's no communication. And then when they say something, they say it in a certain way, you've got no idea what they're saying. They could be laughing, they could be joking, they could be saying a compliment to you, but the way they say it in your mind is he saying something bad about me? Is he mocking me? Is he mocking the cross that I'm wearing? Or is he mocking the Quran? Is he mocking that? It's that lack of understanding. And I remember when I was a kid, when I came to Cathay, when I came to China a long time ago, I had no idea of the language. A lot of times I took the wrong end of the stick. A lot of times when people were saying something, I had no idea, but the way they were saying it was in a cultural way that I would interpret it the wrong way. And that's the problem we have. It's the huge lack of misunderstanding, the huge confusion, a huge lack of clarity that creates all this negativity, that creates all this hate, that creates all this dark mythology. And then suddenly that mythology becomes fact. There's hatred, there's anger, there's violence, there's death, there is war, whether it's the verbal war or physical war. And then there is division, and then that's what divides people. Not saying different people are all innocent. I'm sure everyone's got a part to play, but it's actually a lot more complicated like this. Because I tell you what, we didn't know about this until we discovered this quite recently, when it came off of why are people saying these things about us and what's going on and what are the root causes of this and how did this start. And after hundreds and hundreds of hours of pouring into pages and getting all the data and all the information, and thank God for, being able to get the right books and talk to the right people and get the information in the age of the superhighway internet, we've been able to ascertain more information faster than ever before, which has been fantastic. But still, there's a lot more learning to be done. And hopefully we can then come together as a people and sit down and discuss this, as opposed to just name calling and pointing the finger, and understanding where we're coming from. And if you disagree with, the Grand Orient of de France, of what they've done, that's the conversation to have with them. If you disagree with our tenets of, a belief in a supreme being, the volume of the sacred law, not talking about politics, religion, that's something we can discuss and have, but that doesn't need to be the name calling, the mythology, the complete falsehoods of demons and demonology and all that kind of stuff associated sometimes to Freemasonry, at least associated to the right, irregular stuff, even though that even not be correct with them. Maybe they did do a couple of things that were politically active and they were politically pushing this. Maybe a lot of their stuff has been kind of like hyperboled and gone hyperbolic, and actually their ability and their influence hasn't been that great post 1905. These are things that all need to be researched and looked into under a forensic lens before we start poking fingers and building these self-hatreds that last for generations and do nothing but cause division. What are your points of view, Billy?
Oh, I agree 100% because that's misinformation and distrust has caused many wars and stuff that should have never happened. When most of the time it's senseless to begin with, because nobody's willing to understand the other person's side. There's, truth has no gray side. It's either truth or it's false. But until people understand the truth, they shouldn't jump to conclusions, which is what I think you're trying to say.
Well said. Any last words, brother? Worshipful brother.
Well, as always, I like to say, thank you for joining us again. And I thank you for always being there. And we're having a little rough time sometimes getting on, and because of our time differences, and Sam's busy with personal life right now, but we'll be getting back to more regular times. And thank you for always being there for us, and Godspeed.
Thank you for listening to On the Level podcast, your Masonic podcast. When you are ready, duly and truly prepared, you can always knock on the door.